again, and welcome to the Safety on the Horizon webinar, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Alona Roitershtein, and I'm the Impact Research Fellow at Aberdeen Business School and Robert Gronlund University in Scotland. And I have Ruby Roberts with me here, Dr. Roberts, who is a Chancellor's Fellow of Industrial Psychology for the Aberdeen Business School as well at Robert Gronlund University here in Scotland. Ruby conducts research to understand how people make decisions and behave in the workplace, specializing in human factors and safety in high-hazard environments. Having worked in a range of sectors, including energy and healthcare, she is now leading a fellowship to apply human factors research to the wind sector to support training standards, operator competence, and industry safety. Without further ado, I will pass on to Ruby to start with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Alona for the introduction and for organising the webinar series that we're having this summer. It's lovely to see some familiar little names popping up, so it's lovely to see. Hello. As Alona said, what we're going to do is a kind of flash through the research survey findings, and that'll give us some time at the end for you to ask me some questions and for me then to ask you some questions in the return. The way that I'm going to structure the presentation is that I recognise that some of you on the call already will be familiar with the project, but for those who may not be familiar with the project, we're going to do a little bit of scene setting in terms of where this project has come from, where that survey and that questionnaire designs come from, and how that fits into a longer line of research. So when we think about the wind industry's growth and we think about how that is growing in response to net zero energy targets and energy demands, we also need to keep in mind that to reach these goals and these targets and to build these wind farms and maintain them, we do need to keep in mind the sheer number of people that we need to recruit and train to be able to keep this workforce going. And one particular group that we are particularly interested in are wind technicians. So these are an essential growth group for which we need to train and recruit about 500,000 by 2028. And now most of these will be new entrants, and this is something that I do think is worth flagging, that many of those people who are going to be moving into that wind workforce are going to be new to this and are not necessarily going to be having a kind of experience in similar sectors. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with wind technicians, they do the essential maintenance work that keeps the wind turbines running. And they're a very interesting group to us psychologists because they're working in often really remote environments where they're facing a whole range of physically demanding situations with a range of different hazards such as weather conditions, ladder climbing, etc. And they're doing this in relatively small teams with limited supervision and often limited comms to the beach. So they're doing quite a challenging task, and they're doing it in a scale, and by that I mean they're doing an awful lot of O&M throughout the day over the season. So with that in mind, it is essential that we maintain the safety and performance of this particular work group as well as the wider wind workforce. And when we look at the safety stats, I know that G+ have just released their new 2025 data, I think on Friday, but when we look at the previous year, we have about 2,000 incidents being reported across 2024, including one fatality. And many of us may feel that globally speaking, that 2,000 incidents is maybe not that high. But researchers at Strathclyde have suggested that actually injury rates are typically 3 to 4 times worse or poorer in comparable industries compared to wind. And from our perspective, this is particularly relevant when we start to understand that a lot of these behavioural issues contribute to this kind of higher injury or offshore injury rate. So with that in mind, one of the ways that we can start to support not just safety management, but also human performance is looking at human factors research. And that's essentially looking at the different factors that influence our ability to do our job well. So that kind of psychological piece at the individual level, also to do with that job that we're being asked to do and the environment that we're working in, and those wider organisational factors. And I just included the Pascal Carrion graphic on the right-hand side as a kind of illustration, as a way of understanding how these different human factors layers can build up to influence that worker at the centre. Now, I won't go into too much detail because I appreciate that quite a few of you on the call will be very familiar with this, but it's worth keeping in mind that human factors research or approaches can be valuable not just for reducing things like human error or improving safety, but you can actually use them to enhance things like training, identify expertise, and then use that to feed into technology or ergonomic design. And in recognition that these approaches are really valuable, you can start to see those ideas being disseminated and uptake across a wide range of sectors, not just in the energy context or the maritime context, but across healthcare, rail, transportation, aviation, etc. So there's a real recognition that this is a valuable way of starting to support human performance and safety management. But when we start to look at the human factors research or human factors approaches that we see in the wind industry, that predominantly focuses on that physiological aspect. And when you have a look at the photographs that I've included here in that slide, you can start to understand why, when you think about how they're transferring to the turbines, how are they getting to work at the start of the day. And if you're talking about onshore, they may not be getting a crew transfer vessel, but they may also be getting into the back of a truck for several hours. They're needing to climb on to that transition point before starting to ascend up to the ladders, up into the nacelle, working in small spaces, doing rope access. So you can start to understand why that physiological element has been taken up in terms of a research approach so far. But keeping that behavioural element in mind, you can also start to understand how those kind of wider human factors might start to fit in. And what we wanted to understand from a starting point was what were those key human factors and how may they be specific to the wind context. And we did that with a scoping review, so a literature review, and you can see the reference for it on the right-hand side. You're welcome to get a free copy of the paper from the research website, which will have a link at the end. But keeping in mind that that's essentially a bunch of academic literature, we wanted to then actually ask people who really were working in the industry, what were they seeing in terms of how these human factors were presenting, particularly for wind technicians. And we had 53 attendees, I think some of them are on the call today, which is fantastic, come together from across the globe to talk about this and to start to map some of that out. And we then use that to build a picture or a map or a framework of how these factors might start to fit together. And I've shown you that on the screen just now, and this is a kind of maybe more academic version. And you'll notice at the top that that is labelled offshore wind technicians, but it's probably worth keeping in mind that most of these will be relevant for the onshore wind context, perhaps with the exception of seasickness. But maybe a little bit of a more accessible and a little bit more of a less dry way of understanding some of that information is to think about that wind technician at the centre and what different human factors may be influencing their ability to do their job well. So at the individual level, we're talking about building up a picture of what's going on in the environment, so your situation awareness, and that's such an important cognitive skill in terms of our decision making and how we perform. But also we're starting to think things around risk perception and attitudes. And wind technicians are going to need to be able to learn to cope with things like stress, fatigue, particularly seasickness, and how do they manage their mental health in what can be quite a challenging work environment. They're also working as part of a crew, and we found that there was an additional crew factors column that you see out with the normal labelling, and these things tend to relate to things like teamwork, how the team shares information, and how that team comes together. So what's that team dynamic like, particularly around if we're in a small group and perhaps somebody is a novice or less experienced and they come into a well-formed group, how acceptable is that to speak up? How does that team work together to relate to those different levels of experience and confidence to a certain extent? We also found that there were a range of tasks that were particularly challenging around ladder climbing, working in confined spaces, and emergency evacuation. But in terms of how they managed the work in particular environment, workload and weather and environmental conditions came up frequently. So how do you manage your work orders when the weather window is starting to close? And there were also points about design issues, particularly around welfare. So to what extent are turbines designed to have humans in them, particularly in terms of do you have access to a toilet? And then lastly, we then top that off in terms of those wider organizational factors around safety leadership, safety culture, and then the nuts and bolts around that organization and how that works in terms of, procedures, HSE management, incident investigation, and then what are the resources that allow us to do that job. So not just equipment, but also the technical competence and training that the workers get. So that gives us a picture of what we're seeing so far, but what we're really interested in is exactly how do workers really experience this. And the reason that I spent a couple of minutes talking through that is that what we wanted to do is break down those 4 layers or 4 elements of human factors and understand how people experience them in reality. And so this is how we designed our human factors worker survey with support from GWO by breaking it down into those 4 categories. That was refined with some industry input, and it resulted in 44 items along with demographics and some open text feedback. And you'll notice that as we go through the results, I'm going to put in little snippets of those open text feedback to give you a little bit more of a flavour of what we've found so far. And we're also going to finish with some self-reported safety experience data. This was run on GDPR compliant GISC with ethics approval, and it's worth keeping in mind that this was completely anonymous, so it didn't ask for questions about your name or your company name. All of those demographics were, optional, with the option to prefer not to respond. So what did we find? We had 202 participants across an 8-week survey, most of whom reported working in either Europe or Asia Pacific. We had them coming from a mix of company types, whether those were service providers or OEMs. And we also found that we had the majority of the respondents were technically frontline workers, so they were a combination of wind technicians with a small percentage of team leads. But we then did get a group, quite a big group, who were HSE specialists or site managers. And because I think it's really helpful to understand generally what people are seeing in terms of what it's like to work in the wind industry, when we go through that set of results, I'm going to include both everybody, so the whole sample set, but I'm also in brackets, I'm going to just talk about those wind technician groups in a couple of places that we think it's particularly pertinent to do so. So that's just to explain when you see that, where that's coming from. We see a mix of terms of base of work. The majority do report being an onshore, but we're seeing a kind of mix of onshore and both as well. It's worthwhile flagging that when we asked about industry experience, generally speaking, when we asked the whole group, they were generally a pretty experienced group. So the largest percentage there on the left-hand side is 10 plus years in that kind of blue turquoise. But when we asked just the wind technician group, we see that kind of a navy and mustard color, illustrating a much less experienced. And that could be because often a wind technician role is at the kind of starting point of your career. But it is worth keeping in mind that generally speaking, when we're talking about that wind technician group, they generally have had less time in the industry. So as I mentioned before, what we're going to do is break down an awful lot of that data into those kind of 4 quadrants or 4 elements of those human factors. We're going to go through those and see what we can find in terms of interesting results. I'm not going to cover absolutely everything, otherwise we'd be here all afternoon, but we are going to give a little bit of a flavour of each one of these. So let's start in that kind of cognitive perspective. So what are those individual factors that those wind technicians are experiencing and that we know that they need? So one of those kind of key cognitive skills that generally workers and operators do need, and actually we all need, is situation awareness. So that's being able to collect information from our environment, build that into a picture of what we think is going on in their environment, and then using that to anticipate what's going to happen. And that's really important for wind technicians to be able to build up that picture, particularly when they're working in a dynamic environment. So we asked them particularly about situation awareness. And what we asked them about was the extent to which they make errors because they didn't notice or weren't aware of something. And what we find is that 50% of all of the respondents report doing that to a certain extent. And that's about on par when we look just at the wind technician group. So that's particularly interesting, though perhaps not that different. We do see something similar in other industries. And I've included some quotes here that maybe perhaps communicate that value around situation awareness a little bit better. So we have our HSE managers, specialists, flagging things around being aware, prepared, having that preventative mindset, being able to listen and anticipate. And often what we find is that when we make situation awareness errors, so we don't notice something, that's often to do with the work environment. But when we ask them about the extent to which their work environment makes it easy to identify key pieces of information, generally most people felt that it was relatively easy to do so, with a proportion who didn't. We then move on to risk-taking. And we wanted to understand the extent to which people are willing to take risks to get those work orders done on time. And what we found is that participants were split to the extent to which that was acceptable. So when we asked the whole group, 60% disagreed that that was not something that would do. But when we asked just the wind technician group, the extent to which they would do that started to go up. And we saw that that is slightly higher for that wind technician group than that overall sample. We also want to understand the wind technicians' experiences of their health and their well-being, because this plays a huge part of their ability to do their job well. In fact, it plays a huge part of all of our ability to do our jobs well. And we asked them about their physical and mental health. And what they generally are saying is that about 84 to 87% of people felt that they had good physical health and good mental health. And we asked about the access to resources, and most felt that they did have access to resources to support their mental health, with a proportion to a certain extent which disagreed. I would just take this with a little bit of a caveat and a little bit of a pinch of salt, because there is, certain stigma attached to reporting on health situations, particularly when they may have consequences to job security. So I would treat these just with a little bit of caution. But within that wind context, there are certain things that we want to know about a little bit more in terms of health and well-being. So particularly for those who are working offshore or they're doing a mix, we wanted to understand the extent to which they experience seasickness. And whilst most do not report having, experienced seasickness either at all or rarely, we do find that 33%, so that's a third, are reporting sometimes, often, or most of the time experiencing. So that is actually quite a large percentage of people who are experiencing that sufficiently enough. And for anybody who's had seasickness, you will know very well that it's not just about being a little nauseous, that this can have an impact on your ability to do your job well, your cognitive function can be impaired. So that seasickness is certainly something to keep an eye on. We also wanted to understand the extent to which they're working beyond the point which they feel exhausted. So we wanted to ask about fatigue, and we found that 41% of respondents were indeed working beyond that point of tiredness or fatigue. And when we specifically just asked that wind technician group, we see that higher. So half are experiencing fatigue really frequently. And then finally, we come to stress. And interestingly, we find that it's about on par. It's a little higher for that wind technician group, but that's essentially 1 in 2, or just over half of the entire sample are experiencing stress to some extent, or pretty frequently. And all of these factors are going to be impacting on people's ability to do their job well. We then come to that teamwork and supervision element, because people are working as part of a crew. And what we find is that when people are working together, they generally report working well as a team to get tasks completed, and they feel comfortable talking to their crew about personal issues and concerns. And similarly, when we ask them about sharing information, we find that 80% report that their briefings include those kind of key pieces of situation awareness information, and particularly on hazards. And then lastly, when we ask about supervisors, the majority report that their supervisors prioritise their crew's safety and provide direction to get things done. But you'll notice that when you look at these percentage points, that whilst generally speaking they are positive, you'll see that in those brackets there are percentages, a reasonable, consistent percentage that perhaps do not experience that. And we see that particularly being flagged in terms of access to leadership training. So at any point in any of our careers, when perhaps we want to move up, we might expect to have some kind of training that would help us to move beyond that technical element. And that's just the same for wind technicians who are perhaps moving from technician 3 into 4 to team lead or to leading hand. And we do see that split about the access to that kind of leadership training, and that we see reflected in the wider literature. We then come to that physical environment, and we particularly interested in lone working. We are aware of the challenges around lone working, and we find that that's split in terms of our response rate, with 41% saying they never do so, but essentially half are lone working to a certain extent. And we then see that reflected in terms of access to lifts. I'm sure that many of us on the call today will be aware of the kind of ongoing conversation in terms of ladder climbing and access to lifts. And we definitely see a split in responses. With 20% essentially saying that they never or rarely have them. And that is slightly higher when we ask just the wind technician group. And if you keep in mind the physical exertion that will be associated with ladder climbing just before you even start the job, that is going to have some consequences. And we then finally come to confined space, and this was an item which was designed in response to conversations that we'd been having in line with designing that questionnaire, and people were talking about kind of the challenges around needing to remove their PPE to get access to those confined spaces. And so whilst most report not doing this, we do have essentially a quarter of people who are sometimes or often removing their PPE to gain access to small spaces. And that is slightly higher when we ask just the wind technician group. And one point that I would flag in those open text comments was from a QHSE manager in terms of that physical environment element, which was about the remoteness of operations, and that's maybe not necessarily always recognised. And then lastly, we come to this piece on welfare. So essentially, do we have access to sanitation, so toilets, being able to wash our hands, etc. Now, this is an ongoing challenge within the industry, so these results are perhaps not too surprising, but we do find that 46% report never or rarely having access to satisfactory sanitation. And when we ask just the wind technician group, that is somewhat higher. So essentially half do not have this at all. We then move outward and we come to those organizational factors. So one of those kind of key areas is around safety culture, and we wanted to ask about managers' commitment to safety, for which most, or 82% indeed, report being that their managers committed to ensuring safety in the workplace. And that's slightly less when we asked the wind technician group, but one of the wind technicians here made a really good argument that safety culture is the currency for success. We then want to ask about leadership safety, and this is where we started to see a split in terms of the extent to which leadership prioritise productivity over safety. And this is a dynamic or a tension that we see across industries. And I've included a quote on the right-hand side here, which may seem quite strong, but I do think it's important to flag that whilst it may not necessarily reflect the overall experience in the industry, this is something that was repeated in those open text comments, and that was that leadership are very strongly promoting productivity over safety, and that person feels that will have really negative consequences. And that's going to really link into that incident reporting. So we asked about the extent to which incidents are reported, and we found that 67% reported that any incident we reported in their company that they work for. That's up to everybody else to decide whether you think that's high or low. The thing that I'm particularly interested in is that 48% worry about the consequences of reporting an incident. And we do see that as a challenge in the wider industry, with many of the respondents encouraging moving toward a learning from opportunities rather than a blame perspective. Now, we do need organisational resources to be able to do these jobs, and so we wanted to understand about access to equipment. And while 75% did report having access to the right job, the right equipment for the right job, there was a fantastic quote from one of the managers here about what happens when you don't have access to the right equipment, and that is that workforce will get creative to get the job done. When we ask about training, most feel that they do receive all the technical training and being able to be prepared for emergency response. We probably should take these into a little bit of a pinch of salt because they are self-reported. But we also want to ask about competence, and this is particularly revealing statistic here, where that 52% feel that a lack of competent workers in their organisations having a negative impact on safety. And that is a little higher when we just asked the wind technician group. And one of the wind technicians left a fantastic comment that really summarises this. So whereas before they had a crew of 4 techs with 1 supervisor, now you just have maybe a leading hand or a team lead here with just 2 years experience trying to run a crew of maybe 5 to 6 with no experience at all. And that is leading to a lot more near misses. So we can see how these different factors are influencing and working together. Now, as I mentioned, I did want to include a little bit of a snapshot of those safety experiences and what we found. So one of the things that we did want to ask is the extent to which people experienced and witnessed these different elements. So let's take these just for a moment and talk about witnessing near misses or witnessing errors that resulted in lost time. And this is within the 12-month window. So this is not entirely just in the last 12 months. And what we found is that essentially three-quarters of the group as a whole have indeed witnessed a near miss, and then about half have witnessed an error that resulted in a lost time incident. But when we just look at the wind technician group over the top, we can see that that's about on par in terms of a near miss, but it is slightly higher when it's in terms of those errors that result in lost time. But these are witnessing quite possibly other people. So what about when we ourselves experience it? So in terms of experiencing a near miss, essentially half of the whole population have experienced one, slightly under half have experienced an incident, and then about 38% have experienced a work-related injury that required first aid. But again, when we start to superimpose just that wind technician group data on, we can start to see that that is somewhat higher when we just look at that wind technician group in terms of their safety experiences. So it certainly gives us a little bit of an insight into how people are actually experiencing these different safety experiences. Now, as you'll have noticed throughout the presentation, there was an awful lot of open text feedback, and I would just quickly flag that it is quite unusual for people to take time to do this, and they've covered these topics, covered a wide range of different kind of elements, and some were short, some were small, but I do think that it indicates an appetite to have worker input and worker engagement in this type of a research, and having an opportunity to talk about these things. So what does exactly this tell us? Right, so let's just recap all of that kind of messy information that I've just shared with you. So we understand that there are a range of different kind of human factors that are being experienced by our wind technician. We're seeing challenges at that kind of individual level in terms of situation awareness, risk-taking, those health elements. There's maybe perhaps a mix of experience in that crew aspect, and there are challenges around the environment and the tasks that they're being asked to do. And all of these will be influenced by that kind of safety culture piece, the extent to which incidents are reported and concerns around that, as well as that kind of organizational resources in terms of training and workforce competence. So we can take a couple of different things from this. Certainly safety is being shaped by a wide range of these different factors, and my perspective is that there certainly does appear to be a mix of safety experiences, and that there may be potentially hidden risks and tensions going on there. I do feel that workers' insights are really valuable because they highlight perhaps gaps and differences between essentially work as imagined in our procedures and then work as done in terms of our real world practice. And that is going to be influencing that, picture beyond our standard incident reporting or managerial accounts. And I certainly do hope that these kind of safety experience data take us a little bit beyond what we would normally see just in terms of our standard incident data from the industry. And by putting all of these different pieces of research together in terms of our lit review and our mapping, and then this worker survey, that can start to give us this more multi-layered understanding of how these kind of human factors operate and interact within the wing context. And we certainly aim that all of this is really around working towards facilitating better safety and training decisions. And that will have a wide range of implications in terms of competency frameworks, organizational practices, standards, and how we can then support that in terms of the sector as it scales up in terms of growth. Where we'll be going next in terms of the specific survey data is doing more detailed analysis, perhaps looking at comparisons between onshore, offshore, or role type, as well as working toward doing some modeling on that. This is a little bit of a question to plant in your head for a few minutes, is that I would like to understand perhaps what you as the attendees and your colleagues who perhaps you might talk to about this feel that you might be able to do with this next. And whilst everybody has, limited time available to them, we did have a little bit of a think about how you may be able to take some of these results away with you and maybe do some different things with them. And that could be, discussing them internally, having conversations about, do these look surprising? Are they as expected? Do these results compare with what you're seeing within your own company? And those who have perhaps a little bit more of a scope to make change, they may want to have a look at your own training guidelines about how are these kind of elements fitted into that, how are they captured in terms of that safety incident reporting, if at all, and how robust is that safety incident procedure. And you may even want to run your own survey, and if you'd like to do that, you're very welcome to get in touch with us. So just as I wrap up, I mean, really key takeaways. Human factors are is somewhat self-explanatory for I suspect, the people on the call today, but these are really valuable for supporting not just safety, but also for human performance. What we're doing here is mapping these key human factors, and what we're finding is that there are gaps between, I think, expectations and realities, and that these workers' protectors are really valuable for making things that are not always visible in our standard routes. And I would certainly invite everybody on today's call or later watching on YouTube to think about how you might be able to apply that within your organization. And I'd like to now just finish with a quote from one of the wind technicians who took time to leave us some comments, because I think this really captures why I am doing this, why everybody on the call is doing this, and why this is so important. Because for me, safety is about getting back to hug your family. And I think that is an incredibly powerful and strong message of exactly why we are doing this and why this is so important. So that is me run through an awful lot of information. I do appreciate that that's a lot to take in a short space of time, particularly if you've just had lunch. But thank you for your time in doing that. Now, just a really quick acknowledgement to everybody who took the time to take part in the survey, who shared the link, and supported us, particularly with the GWO dropped object working group. So thank you so much, and I will now hand back over to Alona.